It wasn't the internet. It wasn't a shift in consumer preference. It wasn't even the natural evolution of the free market. It was the efficiency trap, a mathematical inevitability that destroys the middle class by feeding them cheap goods while starving them of fair wages. We look at the empty storefronts on Main Street. We see the shuttered factories in the Rust Belt. We watch the stagnation of real wages since the 170s. And we are told this is simply progress. We are told that everyday low prices are a gift. But the arithmetic tells a different story. The pattern is unmistakable. History shows us exactly what happens when an economy prioritizes the efficiency of consumption over the stability of production. It creates a temporary golden age of abundance, followed by a permanent age of servitude. The mechanism is simple: consolidate the supply chain, undercut the competition, monopolize the labor market, and then extract the wealth. This is not a new business model invented in Bentonville, Arkansas. It is a recurring historical cycle that has hollowed out empires for 2,000 years. The data is clear, the incentives are aligned, and the outcome is written in the ledgers of fallen states. To understand why the American middle class is disappearing, we cannot just look at quarterly earnings reports. We must look at the structural collapse of independent commerce. We must look at the Roman Republic. We must look at the Spanish Empire. We must look at the British decline, because in every single instance, the promise of cheaper goods was the Trojan horse that destroyed the independent citizen, just like the modern era. These empires didn't collapse because they lacked wealth. They collapsed because that wealth was siphoned into a bottleneck, leaving the majority of the population dependent on the state or the monopolist for their very survival. The pattern repeats. The arithmetic is merciless, and current data suggest we are nearing the final stage of this cycle. Let us begin with the first clear example of this phenomenon. The Roman Republic, specifically the transition to empire in the 1st century BC, and the subsequent economic rot that led to the crisis of the 3rd century. Most observers focus on the emperors and the wars, but the real destruction of Rome happened in the fields for centuries. The backbone of Roman power was the small, independent farmer. The soldier citizen, he owned his land. He worked it with his family. He bought goods from local artisans. This was the Roman middle class. But as Rome expanded, it acquired massive territories in Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. The elite, the senatorial class, saw an opportunity for efficiency. They created the latifundia*. These were massive, industrial-scale agricultural estates. They were the big box stores of the ancient world. They did not employ free Roman citizens. They used slave labor captured in foreign wars. The cost of production on a latifundia* was virtually zero compared to the small family farm. The arithmetic was brutal. The latifundia* flooded the Roman market with cheap grain. The price of food dropped. This seemed like a benefit to the consumer, but the consumer was also the producer. The small Roman farmer could not compete with the industrial scale and zero labor costs of the elite estates. He went bankrupt. He sold his land to the very latifundia* that destroyed him. He moved to the city of Rome, desperate for work, but there was no work. Because the slave labor had taken the jobs, the independent middle class was liquidated. They became the proletary*, a class that owned nothing and produced nothing. To keep them from revolting, the state had to step in. This is the origin of the bread and circuses. The state began the *kira anonai*, the grain dole, free food for the displaced masses. The incentive was political stability. The payoff was immediate pacification, but the cost was the soul of the economy. By the time of Emperor Nero, in the 1st century AD, the Roman economy was no longer a network of independent producers. It was a top-heavy system of massive estates feeding a dependent, impoverished populace. The wealth gap was astronomical. When the crisis of the 3rd century hit, the tax base was gone. There was no middle class left to tax. The currency was debased to pay for the dole. Inflation soared, and the once proud Roman citizen was reduced to a serf, tied to the land of the wealthy, simply to eat just like Rome. The Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries fell into a similar trap of false abundance. The discovery of the Americas brought unimaginable wealth to Spain. Gold and silver flooded into Seville. It was the greatest influx of liquidity in human history up to that point. On the surface, Spain was the richest nation on earth, but look at the mechanics of the Spanish economy during the price revolution. The influx of silver caused massive inflation. Prices in Spain skyrocketed. However, because Spain had so much hard currency, it became cheaper to import goods than to make them. Why make wool in Castile when you can buy it cheaper from the Netherlands? Why make furniture in Toledo when you can import it from Italy? The Spanish elite, flush with American silver, stopped investing in local industry. They became consumers of foreign efficiency. The incentive was to buy the best goods at the best price. The risk was the atrophy of domestic production. The Spanish middle class, the artisans, the weavers, the tanners, was decimated. They could not compete with the flood of imports. The cost of living in Spain rose due to the silver inflation, but their wages stagnated because their industries were dying. By the early 17th century, under the reign of Philip III and Philip IV, Spain was hollow. They had money, but they had no economy. They had consumption, but no production. The Spanish writer González de Celerigo wrote in 1600, "Those who can will not work, and those who would cannot find work." The middle class vanished. Society bifurcated into a tiny elite of landowning aristocrats and church officials, and a massive underclass of beggars and vagrants. When the silver shipments from the Americas began to slow down, the collapse was total. There was no industrial base to fall back on. The empire that owned the world went bankrupt not once, but 9 times between 1557 and 1666. The lesson is clear. Cheap access to goods, funded by a distortion in money or labor, destroys the local capacity to produce. It feels like wealth, but it is actually liquidation, just like the Spanish Empire. The British Empire in the 20th century faced a reckoning between global efficiency and domestic stability. But let us look specifically at the period of the British decline from 114 through the 170s. The British Empire was built on trade and industry, but as the 20th century progressed, the arithmetic changed. Britain had been the workshop of the world, but other nations specifically, the United States and Germany, began to produce more efficiently. The British elite, centered in the City of London, prioritized the strength of the pound sterling and the returns on foreign investment over domestic manufacturing. They chose the financial sector over the industrial sector. The incentive was to maintain Britain's role as the global banker. The payoff was high returns for the capital class. The risk was the erosion of the working and middle class in the industrial North. Throughout the mid-20th century, British policy favored hard money and open markets. This allowed cheap imports to flood the British Isles. A British worker in Sheffield or Manchester in the 160s found that the goods in the shops were affordable, often imported from the recovering economies of Europe or Asia. But his factory was closing. The consolidation of British industry into massive, state-backed conglomerates like British Leyland did not save them. It only delayed the pain. By the 170s, the British disease had set in stagflation, high unemployment, a middle class that saw its standard of living collapse, even as the financial center in London remained wealthy. The government attempted to paper over the cracks with subsidies and welfare, but the structural damage was done. The independent tradesman, the small shopkeeper, the local manufacturer, they had been squeezed out by the dual forces of global efficiency and financial centralization. When the IMF had to bail out the UK in 176, it was the final admission that the model had failed. You cannot consume more than you produce forever, and you cannot build a middle class on cheap imports and government handouts. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is innovation and efficiency. A new model is introduced. It offers lower prices and higher convenience. In the Roman context, this was the asterisk latifundia asterisk. In the modern context, it is the big box retailer or the digital marketplace. The consumer benefits immediately. The surplus income feels like a raise. Stage 2 is predatory pricing. The new entity uses its scale to lower prices below the cost of production for smaller competitors. This is not accidental, it is strategic. The goal is not profit, yet the goal is market share, the local butcher, the regional hardware store, the family farm. They attempt to match prices, but the arithmetic is against them. They burn through their reserves. Stage 3 is market dominance. The competition capitulates. The independent businesses close. The landscape shifts. The consumer now has fewer choices, but the prices remain low. So the danger is masked. The new entity becomes the primary employer in the regio. Stage 4 is monopsony power. This is the pivot point. The entity is now so large that it dictates terms not just to consumers, but to suppliers. It forces manufacturers to lower their costs to stay on the shelves. Manufacturers respond by outsourcing labor, cutting quality, or shrinking package sizes. The pressure moves up the supply chain, depressing wages globally. Stage 5 is wage stagnation. With local competition destroyed, the dominant entity caps wages. There is no alternative employer for the low-skilled or semi-skilled worker. The displaced small business owners enter the labor pool as employees, increasing the supply of labor and further suppressing wages. The community's wealth extraction begins. Profits do not stay local. They flow to the corporate center. Stage 6 is quality degradation and service reduction. With the market captured, the incentive to please the customer diminishes. The low price becomes the only metric. Durability of goods declines. Staffing levels are cut to the bone. The consumer experience degrades, but the consumer has nowhere else to go. They are trapped in the ecosystem. Stage 7 is social fracture. The tax base of the local community collapses as small businesses vanish. Public services degrade. The middle class, now priced out of asset ownership and reliant on low-wage service jobs, becomes dependent on credit or state aid to maintain their standard of living. The gap between the corporate owners and the local population becomes unbridgeable. Just like Rome, just like Spain, just like Britain, the United States has entered the final phases of this cycle. Current data suggest we are firmly in stage 7. The mapping is precise. Consider the rise of Walmart and its subsequent digital successors in the 180s and 10s. The narrative was everyday low prices. It was a miracle for the American consumer. Inflation was tamed, in part, by the massive deflationary pressure of the big box model. A television that cost a month's wages in 180 cost a few days' wages in 2010. But look at the cost on the other side of the ledger. Estimates range, but economic historians note that for every job created by a big box retailer, approximately 14 jobs were destroyed in local retail. But it wasn't just a swap of one retail job for another. It was the destruction of the proprietor class. The local hardware store owner was a pillar of the middle class. He kept his profits in the town. He used local accountants, local banks, local services. When he was replaced by a manager of a national chain, that web of economic interdependence was severed. The profits were wired to headquarters. The manager had no autonomy to hire local service firms. The multiplier effect of money in the local economy collapsed. Then came the monopsony phase. In the 2000s, the dominance of the big box model forced American manufacturers to move to China. To meet the price demands of the retailer, they had to slash labor costs. The China shock that devastated the American Rust Belt was not just a geopolitical event. It was the direct result of the efficiency demands of the American retail sector. The American middle-class worker was effectively firing himself every time he shopped for the lowest price. The incentive was to save $10 on a toaster. The payoff was a slightly higher disposable income in the short term. The risk was the elimination of the manufacturing wage that allowed him to buy the toaster in the first place. Now, we see the result, the hollowing out of the American workforce. We have high-end service class finance, tech, law, and a low-end service class retail. Logistics, care. The middle is gone. Real wages for the bottom 50% have stagnated for decades when adjusted for the true cost of living housing, healthcare, and education. The goods are cheap, but the life is expensive. This is the Roman trap: cheap grain, but no land; cheap TVs, but no assets. Some economists argue that this efficiency is a net positive. They point to the Consumer Price Index. They say that the poor can afford more goods than ever before. This is the standard counter-argument. But the rebuttal is found in the balance sheet, not the income statement. A middle class is defined by asset ownership and financial independence, not by the volume of plastic goods they can consume. If you can buy a 40-inch screen, but you cannot afford a house, you are not middle class. You are a well-entertained serf. The arithmetic of the big box model requires the suppression of labor costs to maintain low prices. It is a deflationary engine for goods and a deflationary engine for wages. Under these constraints, the rational move for the corporation is to automate, outsource, and squeeze. Under these constraints, the rational move for the citizen is to borrow, and that is what has happened. Household debt has exploded. As wages have flatlined, we are funding our consumption with leverage. Just as Rome funded its dole with currency debasement, there are three possible endgames. The first is controlled decline. In this scenario, the status quo is maintained through increasing government subsidies. Universal basic income, or expanded welfare, becomes the modern bread and circuses. The corporate monopolies are taxed slightly more to fund the consumption of their own goods. The middle class permanently disappears, replaced by a subsidized lower class. This is the path of least resistance. The second is chaotic collapse. The supply chains, stretched too thin and reliant on global stability, fracture. The just-in-time efficiency model fails. Prices spike rapidly. The population, having no local production capacity and no savings, faces immediate shortages. Social unrest follows. We saw previews of this in 2020. The third is reset and restructure. This involves a painful return to localization tariffs, antitrust enforcement that breaks up the monopsonies, and a deliberate acceptance of higher prices in exchange for higher domestic wages. It requires reindustrialization. It is inflationary in the short term, but restorative in the long term. History suggests the first option is the most likely choice of the political class. It is the path of Rome. It is the path of late-stage empire. The preservation of the illusion of wealth at the cost of the substance of wealth. The only variable is timing and pain. Subscribe.